The old saying always went, if it ain't Boeing, I ain't going. And it was a saying that not only showed allegiance to a favorite heavy airframe manufacturer, but it also had an underlying sense of patriotism too. I mean, it'd be hard to argue that Boeing isn't an American institution, right? A U.S. company that for decades dominated the global airframe market, and even though Airbus has made things a little more of a duopoly over the last couple decades, and I'm going to sidestep a whole bunch of politics here, the Boeing versus Airbus thing is a lot more than just two companies competing in a market. It's ideological. Patriotically, I think it represents the position of the United States in the global transportation market, and that alone is enough for most Americans to take up an opinion. But for us aviators, there's an even bigger issue, and it's one of control. And not just in business, but in a fundamental physical form. And that's because Boeing trusts you to have it. Or at least, they always did. Welcome. This is Podcasting on a Plane. I'm Brandon Gonzalez, and this is your Aviation Audio Magazine. We hit aviation from as many angles as possible, and my favorite two angles are from the cockpit and from the tower. And that's because I'm an air traffic tower controller at a busy general aviation airport. But I'm also a pilot specializing in high-performance transition training and mentoring pilots in the complex world of our national airspace system. Or, put more simply, I'm the one you call if you're a GA pilot and you want to level up your game in both the plane and on the radios. But if you just want to listen to a podcast today, well, you're still in luck, because on this one, we share stories, news, and experiences that'll help you love aviation even more. It's a little harder today, though, and that's because we're going to have some of those really awkward conversations about the situation everybody just kind of wants to go away. You know, the one about Max. The 737 Max, that is. Yep, the saga rolls on, and the latest notable development is that Indonesia recently released the final accident report on Lion Air 610, and in its wake, the industry is being forced to adapt. Let's start with an article from Aerotime News Hub by Clement Sharp and Tro. It's dated October 25th, 2019, and it's called Lion Air Crash Report Points to Boeing, FAA, and Airline Flaws. He writes, the final report of the Indonesian investigators says the design and development of the MCAS system by Boeing was the main cause for the crash of Lion Air 737 MAX flight JT610 on October 29, 2018, that killed 189 passengers and crew. Improper certification, training, and maintenance issues were also pointed at as contributing factors. The Indonesian National Transportation Safety Committee, KNKT, found out that a failure of the MCAS system resulting in a loss of control of the aircraft was not sufficiently taken into account during design and certification, blaming both Boeing and the U.S. FAA. The manufacturer and the authority should, quote, more closely scrutinize the development and certification process for systems whose malfunction has the ability to lead to loss of control of the airplane, states the report. And they added that, quote, MCAS function was not a fail-safe design and did not include redundancy. Inconsistencies were found in the MCAS certification report. The system's known for correcting the angle of the stabilizers by 2.5 degrees, yet the FAA documents stated that the maximum was only 0.6. Quote, it caused a much greater movement of the stabilizer than was specified in that original safety analysis document, is noted in the report. The investigators estimate that the FAA delegated too much of its responsibility to Boeing engineers under the Organization Designation Authorization (ODA) program that allowed the manufacturer to conduct safety inspections and certification of its aircraft using its own engineers certified by the authority. And it's already been called into question by the Joint Authorities Technical Review, JATR, conducted by a committee regrouping the FAA, the European Aviation Safety Agency, EASA, and aviation authorities from Australia, Brazil, Canada, China, United Arab Emirates, Indonesia, Japan, and Singapore, as well as NASA, published on October 14, 2019. The investigators found out that the design of multiple alerts also contributed to the failure of the flight crew to address the problem correctly, as had already been reported by the NTSB in September 2019. Quote, flight test pilots generally have more knowledge about the aircraft design characteristics than normal pilots. This level of competence usually cannot be translated to most pilots, says the KNKT. Furthermore, manuals issued to pilots were not complete enough for them to diagnose MCAS problems correctly. But the pilots are not exempt from criticism. It appears that one of them was unfamiliar with the procedures and had encountered difficulties in piloting the aircraft during his training, resulting in improper reactions. Despite the captain managing to lift the nose of the aircraft up 20 times, his first officer was unable to complete the checklist that would have deactivated the MCAS. Lion Air maintenance workers were also found responsible. One of the AOA probes installed on the aircraft, supplied secondhand by a Florida-based company, Extra Aerospace, was found faulty. However, it had not been tested during the installation. Moreover, despite similar erroneous readings occurring on the previous flight operated by the aircraft, Lion Air maintenance personnel did not make the decision to keep the aircraft on the ground. Data from the previous flight showed that the readings differed by 21 degrees between the two sensors. The report thus recommends for Lion Air to better assess the training of its pilots and maintenance engineers. And as for Boeing, it should reconsider the design and documentation of the MCAS, as well as any coming systems capable of taking over control from pilots. The alert system should also better take into consideration pilots' response time. Following the publication of the report, Boeing released a statement in which it promises to address the KNKT safety recommendations and take, quote, actions to enhance the safety of the 737 MAX to prevent the flight control conditions that occurred in this accident from ever happening again. It claims already having added a fail-safe concept to the updated version of the MCAS that will rely on two sensors and only activate if the readings match. Crew manuals and pilot training are also being reviewed. So, as stated in the article, Boeing responded with a final statement on October 25th that says, quote, on behalf of everyone at Boeing, I want to convey our heartfelt condolences to the families and loved ones of those who lost their lives in these accidents. We mourn with Lion Air, and we would like to express our deepest sympathies to the Lion Air family, end quote, said Boeing President and CEO Dennis Muhlenberg. Quote, these tragic events have deeply affected us all, and we'll always remember what happened. We commend Indonesia's National Transportation Safety Committee for its extensive efforts to determine the facts of the accident, the contributing factors to its cause, and recommendations aimed toward our common goal that this never happens again. We're addressing the KNKT safety recommendations and taking actions to enhance the safety of the 737 MAX to prevent the flight control conditions that occurred in this accident from ever happening again. Safety is an enduring value for everyone at Boeing, and the safety of the flying public, our customers, and the crews aboard our airplanes is always our top priority. We value our long-standing partnership with Lion Air, and we look forward to continuing to work together in the future, end quote. Boeing experts working as technical advisors to the U.S. NTSB have supported the KNKT over the course of the investigation. The company's engineers have been working with the U.S. FAA and other global regulators to make software updates and other changes, taking into account the information from the KNKT's investigation. Since this accident, the 737 MAX and its software are undergoing an unprecedented level of global regulatory oversight, testing, and analysis. This includes hundreds of simulator sessions and flight tests, and regulatory analyses of thousands of documents reviewed by regulators and independent experts, and extensive certification requirements. Over the past several months, Boeing's been making changes to the 737 MAX. Most significantly, Boeing has redesigned the way the AOA sensors work with a feature of the flight control software known as MCAS. Going forward, MCAS will compare information from both AOA sensors before activating, adding a new layer of protection. In addition, MCAS will now only turn on if both AOA sensors agree. It will only activate once in response to erroneous AOA and will always be subject to a maximum limit that can be overridden with the control column. These software changes will prevent the flight control conditions that occurred in this accident from ever happening again. In addition, Boeing is updating crew manuals and pilot training designed to ensure every pilot has all the information they need to fly the 737 MAX safely. Boeing continues to work with the FAA and other regulatory agencies worldwide on the certification process of the software update and training program to safely return the 737 MAX to service. Now, obviously Boeing needs to fix the software, and they promise they're going to. In a CNN Business article by Jill Dices and Charisse Pham on October 25th that covers Boeing's statement from a moment ago, they say, Boeing said Friday that it's addressing safety recommendations raised by Indonesian investigators about its 737 MAX aircraft to ensure that a fatal crash, quote, never happens again. The promise was part of Boeing's lengthy response to the final report from Indonesia's National Transportation Safety Committee into last year's crash of a Lion Air flight. Investigators faulted the poor design of the MAX and a lack of regulatory oversight from the U.S. FAA, along with errors by flight crews. The agency plans to make the report public Friday, roughly a year after the 737 MAX 8 plane crashed into the Java Sea. Ahead of the report's publication, investigators held a press conference in Jakarta. A summary of the report blames the crash on faulty assumptions made during the design and certification of the 737 MAX and how pilots would respond to malfunctions by the MCAS system. CNN saw a presentation of the summary earlier this week. A press release detailing the report's findings was also released Friday. MCAS lowers the nose of a plane when it receives information that the aircraft is flying too slowly or steeply and at risk of stalling. The system was vulnerable because it had relied on a single angle of attack sensor, investigators said. The AOA sensor on the doomed Lion airplane experienced issues on earlier flights and was replaced, but the airline's maintenance crews and pilots couldn't identify the problem because one of the aircraft's safety features, the AOA disagree alert, was not correctly enabled during Boeing 737 MAX 8 development, they said. Boeing has admitted that this feature should have been standard and was instead enabled only for airlines that purchased an optional upgrade, and has said that it will fix the problem. Investigators also said that the crew on the flight before the one that had crashed experienced problems, but deactivated the MCAS system and flew the plane to its destination. but that flight crew did not report all the issues they experienced to the maintenance crew. Investigators also concluded that issues with the flight crew communication and distractions were contributing factors to the crash, according to the summary. The 737 MAX has been grounded since March after a 737 MAX operated by Ethiopian crashed. That flight shared similarities with the fatal Lion Air flight. The two crashes killed 346 people. Boeing on Friday said it's been working to update the MCAS system in the wake of those crashes. Going forward, Boeing said its MCAS system will compare information from 2 AOA sensors on the plane before it activates, quote, adding a new layer of protection. The redesign also means that pilots experiencing an MCAS malfunction will be able to pull back on the control column and deactivate the system. Pilots on both Lion Air and Ethiopian fatal flights struggled to override the plane's automatic systems before crashing, according to preliminary reports. Boeing also says it's, quote, updating crew manuals and pilot training designed to ensure every pilot has all the information they need to fly the 737 MAX safely, end quote. Boeing's continued to build the 737 MAX in order to try to meet a backlog of more than 4,000 orders for the plane that it has on the books, but it won't get most of the revenue from sales until plane delivery. It's not clear when the plane will return to the skies. The U.S. FAA said last week that it's following a, quote, thorough process, not a prescribed timeline for returning the Boeing 737 MAX to passenger service, end quote. Decisions made by the agency and the aircraft makers have come under scrutiny in multiple investigations and reviews in the months since the plane crashed. On Friday, the FAA said its, quote, first priority is always safety, and that the Indonesian Committee's accident report on Lion Air, quote, is a sober reminder to us of the importance of that mission. And Lion Air called the crash a, quote, unthinkable tragedy and one that the relatives and friends of those who were lost will continue to mourn. It's essential to determine the root cause and contributing factors to the accident and take immediate corrective actions to ensure that an accident like this one never happens again, the airline said in a statement on Friday. So, in light of that, one might wonder if the senior executives at Boeing have actually been held accountable for their actions, or better yet, inactions. And the answer is yes, sort of. CEO Dennis Muhlenberg has kept his job as CEO for now, but he's been stripped of the title of chairman of the board. And as you'll hear in our next article, Kevin McAllister, the head of its commercial aircraft division, has also been removed from his position entirely. On October 22, 2019, Airwise News reports that Boeing has ousted Kevin McAllister, the head of its commercial aircraft division, as the 8-month grounding of the 737 MAX stretches on. McAllister, who was appointed CEO of Boeing Commercial in November 2016, has received criticism from some quarters for his handling of the FAA's grounding of the MAX family of aircraft after 2 fatal crashes caused the deaths of 346 people. Quote, we're grateful to Kevin for his dedicated and tireless service to Boeing, its customers, and its communities during a challenging time, and for his commitment to support the transition, Boeing Chief Executive Dennis Muhlenberg said. Muhlenberg himself received bad news last week when he was stripped of the chairmanship of the company board. McAllister has been replaced by Stan Deal, a 33-year veteran of the company who was head of Boeing Global Services prior to the promotion. Ted Colbert will replace Deal at Services. Quote, Stan brings an extensive operational experience at Boeing commercial airplanes and trusted relationships with our airline customers and industry partners, Muhlenberg said. Ted brings to our global services business an enterprise approach to customers and strong digital business expertise, a key component of our long-term growth plans, end quote. In turn, Colbert has been replaced by Vishwa Udanwadekar as interim chief information officer and senior vice president of IT and data analytics. Quote, the Boeing board fully supports these leadership moves, Chairman David Calhoun said. Quote, Boeing will emerge stronger than ever from its current challenges, and the changes we're making throughout Boeing will benefit the flying public well into the future, end quote. Boeing's making progress with the recertification of the 737 MAX. The FAA now has the final version of the updated control software, but with aviation regulators around the world expected to work through the changes at their own rate, a return to service is still some weeks away. North American operators of MAX aircraft have removed the plane from their schedules until early next year, Southwest last week extending its removal until February 8th. Well, at the risk of stoking the fire a little more, I think it's probably time to read an article from the New York Times, and it's called Boeing Pilot Complained of Egregious Issue with the 737 MAX in 2016. It's by David Gellis and Natalie Kitroff, and it was updated October 23, 2019. For months, Boeing said that it had no idea that a new automated system in the 737 MAX jet, which played a role in 2 fatal crashes, was unsafe. But on Friday, the company gave lawmakers a transcript revealing that a top pilot working on the plane had raised concerns about the system in messages to a colleague in 2016, more than 2 years before the MAX was grounded because of the accidents, which left 346 people dead. In the messages, the pilot, Mark Faulkner, who played a central role in the development of the plane, complained about the system known as MCAS. It was acting unpredictably in a flight simulator. It said, quote, it's running rampant. The messages are from November 2016, months before the MAX was certified by the FAA. Quote, granted, "I suck at flying, but even this was egregious," he said sardonically to a colleague, according to a transcript of the exchange reviewed on Friday by the New York Times. The MAX crisis has consumed Boeing, and the revelation of the messages from Mr. Faulkner comes at a particularly sensitive time. The company's chief executive, Dennis A. Muhlenberg, is scheduled to testify before 2 congressional committees on October 29th and October 30th, the first time a Boeing executive has appeared at a hearing related to the crashes. Boeing stock lost 7% of its value on Friday, adding to the financial fallout. The existence of the messages strike at Boeing's defense that it had done nothing wrong regarding the MAX because regulators had cleared the plane to fly, and potentially increases the company's legal exposure as it faces civil and criminal investigations from the multiple lawsuits related to both crashes. Facing competition from Airbus, Boeing worked to produce the MAX as quickly as possible, striving to minimize costly training for pilots. Last week, a task force of 10 international regulators released a report that found that Boeing had not fully explained MCAS to the FAA. Quote, "This is more evidence that Boeing misled pilots, government regulators, and other aviation experts about the safety of the 737 MAX," John Weeks, president of the Southwest Airlines Pilots Association, said in a statement on Friday. Boeing's maintained that the MAX was certified in accordance with all appropriate regulations, suggesting that there was no sign that the MCAS was unsafe. That contention was central to the company's rationale in not grounding the MAX after the crash of Lion Air 610 last October, and in waiting days to recommend grounding the plane after the second crash of Ethiopian Flight 302 in March. It was only after data suggested the MCAS played a role in the second crash that Boeing and the FAA decided to ground the MAX. Mr. Faulkner was the chief technical pilot for the MAX and was in charge of communicating with the FAA group that determined how pilots would be trained before flying it. He helped Boeing convince the international regulators that the MAX is safe to fly. In the messages, he said that during tests in 2016, the simulator showed the plane making unexpected movements through a process called trimming. Quote, "The plane is trimming itself like crazy," he wrote to Patrick Gustafson, a fellow 737 technical pilot at Boeing. "I'm like, what?" End quote. Mr. Faulkner went on to say that he had lied to the FAA. Quote, "I basically lied to the regulators unknowingly," Mr. Faulkner says in the messages, though it was not clear what he specifically was referring to. Lawmakers, regulators, and pilots responded with swift condemnation on Friday. Quote, "This is the smoking gun," Representative Peter DeFazio, Democrat of Oregon, said in an interview. Quote, "This is no longer just a regulatory failure and a culture failure. It's starting to look like criminal misconduct." Senator Richard Blumenthal, Democrat of Connecticut, said he expected answers from Boeing's chief executive and the board of directors. Quote, "They must be held accountable if Boeing was deceptive or misleading in failing to report these safety concerns. What if these reports indicate that Boeing's own employees lied and concealed the truth?" End quote. FAA Administrator Stephen Dixon sent Mr. Muhlenberg a letter Friday morning demanding that the company account for why it had not provided the messages to the agency earlier. Quote, "I expect your explanation immediately regarding the content of this document and Boeing's delay in disclosing the document to its safety regulator," Mr. Dixon wrote. A Boeing spokesman, Gordon Johnroe, said the company was, quote, "voluntarily cooperating with the congressional investigation and provided the messages to lawmakers as part of that process." He noted that the company gave the messages to the Department of Justice, which is conducting a criminal investigation into Boeing, earlier this year. A Boeing spokesman said the company did not give the messages to the FAA earlier because of the ongoing criminal investigation. The MAX has been grounded for more than 7 months, and airlines do not expect it to fly again this year. The FAA and Boeing have repeatedly pushed back the expected date of the plane's return to service as regulators and the company uncover new problems with the plane. The crisis has already cost Boeing more than $8 billion. It has disrupted expansion plans for airlines around the world, which have had to cancel thousands of flights and lost hundreds of millions of dollars in sales. The Times, which was the first to disclose Mr. Faulkner's involvement with the plane, previously reported that he had failed to tell the FAA that the original version of the MCAS was being overhauled, leaving regulators with the impression that the system was relatively benign and would be used only in rare cases. 8 months before the messages were exchanged, Mr. Faulkner had asked the FAA if it would be okay to remove the mention of MCAS from the pilot's manual. The FAA, which at the time believed the system would activate only in rare cases and wasn't dangerous, approved Mr. Faulkner's request. Another exchange in a batch of emails among Mr. Faulkner, Boeing colleagues, and FAA officials was also reviewed by the Times on Friday. In one email from November 2016, Mr. Faulkner wrote that he was, quote, "Jedi mind-tricking regulators into accepting the training that I got accepted by the FAA." End quote. A lawyer for Mr. Faulkner downplayed the importance of the messages, suggesting Mr. Faulkner was talking about issues with the simulator. If you read the whole chat, it's obvious that there was no lie, and the simulator program was not operating properly, the lawyer David Gerger said in a statement. Quote, "Based on what he was told, Mark thought the plane was safe, and the simulator would be fixed." End quote. Flight simulators replicate real cockpits and are used to test planes during development. They can sometimes behave unpredictably depending on their configuration. Mr. Faulkner, who's now a pilot for Southwest Airlines, and Mr. Gustafson did not respond to requests for comment. Boeing provided the transcript to lawmakers on Capitol Hill on Friday morning in advance of the hearings this month at which Mr. Muhlenberg will testify about the crashes for the first time. Reuters was first to report on the existence of the transcript. Mr. DeFazio, who, as chairman of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, is overseeing the investigation into the crashes, said he reviewed the other internal Boeing documents and emails that suggested employees were under pressure to produce planes as fast as possible and avoid additional pilot training. Quote, Boeing cannot say this is about one person, Mr. DeFazio said. Quote, this is about a cultural failure at Boeing under pressure from Wall Street to get this thing out there and to make sure you don't open the door to further pilot training. End quote. Now, as a pilot, Boeing or not, there's no way something like this could get by me without creating some less than pleasant emotions. I've flown on a MAX once as a passenger. I've never been at the controls. Had it been my job, though, to fly one of these, I don't think I'd be happy. Like, if I was expected to fly one, but never told of the danger I was in, I'd find it to be unsatisfactory that the manufacturer I trust had so little regard for the safety of me and the flying public, and that they'd have put us in this kind of danger for their own financial gain. But more simply, I'd be really pissed off. And I'm sure that if I was a line pilot, I'd have a union that felt similarly. And oh look, on October 7th, David Koenig in Dallas writes for the Associated Press that Southwest Pilot Union sues Boeing over grounding of the plane. He writes, the union representing Southwest Airlines pilots is suing Boeing, saying its pilots are losing money because the company rushed an unsafe plane into service, only to have the 737 MAX grounded after 2 deadly crashes. The Southwest Airlines Pilots Association said in the lawsuit filed Monday that Boeing misled pilots and airlines by not telling them about a new flight control system called MCAS that's now at the center of investigations into the accidents. The lawsuit, filed in a Texas state court in Dallas, could make it harder for Boeing to gain public confidence in the plane. Chicago-based Boeing hopes to use pilots in a campaign to reassure travelers once regulators approve changes that the company is making to the plane. Quote, we believe this lawsuit is meritless and will vigorously defend against it, Boeing responded in a statement from spokesman Charles Bickers. Quote, we continue to work with Southwest Airlines and its pilots on efforts to safely return the MAX to service. End quote. Southwest had more MAX jets than any airline when the plane was grounded in March. The union says the grounding has eliminated more than 30,000 Southwest flights. The president of the pilots union said in an interview that the lawsuit followed failed negotiations with Boeing over compensation for more than $100 million in income the pilots have lost due to canceled flights. Also at issue were the union's expenses to comply with a subpoena from the Justice Department, which is conducting a criminal investigation into Boeing's representations to regulators who certify the plane. The union leader, John Weeks, says he believes Boeing will make the plane safe and pilots will resume flying it. Quote, when the plane comes back, it'll be one of the most examined airplanes ever, he said. The problems they had with the MCAS are being engineered out of it. End quote. The lawsuit, however, uses harsh language in condemning Boeing for what it told airlines and pilots about the MAX, which went into service in 2017. Boeing sold the plane as a more fuel-efficient but otherwise lightly modified version of the 737, which has flown since the 1960s. Quote, those representations proved to be false, the union said in its lawsuit. Quote, the 737 MAX now is grounded worldwide because it's unsafe, unairworthy, and contrary to Boeing's representations, distinct from the 737 family of aircraft that preceded it, which Southwest pilots have flown for years. Before both crashes, MCAS was activated by faulty sensor readings and pushed the plane's noses down. The union charged that Boeing abandoned good design practices and withheld key safety information from regulators in its rush to get the plane on the market. The lawsuit cited news accounts for many of its claims. Investigations at the time had not been completed into crashes in Indonesia and Ethiopia that killed 346 people. Boeing faces dozens of lawsuits filed by passengers' families and has settled a few for undisclosed terms. In July, it announced a $4.9 billion after-tax charge to cover compensation it expects to pay airlines in coming years to cover canceled flights. Boeing expects the MAX to fly again this year. Southwest dropped the plane from its schedule through January 5th, and Weeks said he doesn't expect it back until February or March. So as we move along through these stories, I feel like even to this day that we're living in some sort of twilight zone where fact is stranger than fiction. And if you're not there yet, well, maybe this next article will help. From Skift, Brian Summers writes on October 24th that Southwest will look at buying jets other than the Boeing 737 after a 48-year run. Conventional wisdom suggests that the late Southwest Airlines founder Herb Kelleher, who conceived the carrier's all-Boeing 737 strategy, would have never considered adding another aircraft type. But Kelleher, one of America's most shrewd airline executives, never issued such an edict. People asked, quote, what would Herb do? Current CEO Gary Kelly said on Thursday in the airline's third-quarter earnings call. Quote, I know what Herb did do because we did this. We looked at it very carefully. End quote. Southwest has flown the Boeing 737 for its entire 48-year history, save for a brief experiment with Boeing 727s, allowing it to save costs on pilot training and maintenance. But the airline has never pledged it would only fly a 737 in perpetuity, and it's not doing so now, Kelly told analysts. Quote, as late as 2011, when we agreed to launch the MAX, we gave a very serious look to an alternative, Kelly said. Quote, there are people who do have this question. Is it time for us to look at the question? Yes. Not now. But next year, maybe the following year, it is time to look at that question yet again. I wouldn't prejudge the answer at all. End quote. The MAX is a hot topic now. Southwest has been unable to fly its 34 newest technology jets since March, when the FAA grounded all MAX jets due to safety concerns. In the first 9 months of the year, Southwest said it lost $435 million in operating income because of the grounding. But this is probably not all MAX related. In recent years, many airlines as large as Southwest, which has 752 airplanes, have decided they can better maximize profits by flying multiple aircraft types. They may spend more to operate several plane models, but they can also increase revenues. And if there's a problem with one aircraft type, they can still operate a mostly normal schedule. Some of the world's most profitable carriers, like Delta, British Airways, and United, fly nearly every airplane manufactured by Airbus and Boeing, allowing them to match capacity with demand. Even Ryanair, which copied Southwest's model for decades, is branching out. It now owns all of Laudamotion, an Austrian low-cost carrier that flies only Airbus jets. Southwest may or may not add a new aircraft type, but it's serious about the process, Kelly said. Quote, what I feel like we're obligated to do is just debate the wisdom, strategically, of having a sole source vendor and one fleet type, he said. I don't know that we have ever focused on it with that type of intensity. End quote. Airlines that fly Boeing and Airbus planes may get a better deal on aircraft. Many airlines like to pit the two manufacturers against each other, allowing them to pay cheaper prices. International Airlines Group, parent of British Airways, Iberia, and several other airlines, recently said that it may take as many as 200 MAX jets, partly because the company's CEO wanted to reduce its reliability on Airbus jets and promote competition among Airbus and Boeing. Southwest knows the economics of airplane purchases, and Kelly admitted that the airline has been sending teams to manufacturers and other airlines to scope out the competition. That could just be a negotiating ploy. Boeing could give Southwest a better deal on future aircraft if it suspects the airline might buy Airbus, or it could be real interest. Jamie Baker, an analyst at J.P. Morgan, pointed out Southwest can acquire Airbus aircraft without placing an order for jets. It could move decisively, Baker said, by acquiring another U.S. airline. Earlier this week, Joseph Donardi, an analyst with Stifel, asked whether Southwest could target Alaska Airlines or JetBlue Airways, which doesn't have any 737s. We believe Southwest may be nearing a tipping point where the duration of the MAX grounding pushes it to consider more significant and strategic solutions, including M&A, he wrote. And he added he had no indication Southwest sought to pursue a deal. While Kelly didn't rule out an acquisition, he said it's unlikely Southwest would acquire another airline for its airplanes. He reminded analysts Southwest bought AirTran in 2011, and it leased out the airline's Boeing 717s because they didn't fit Southwest's model. Quote, to say today, does that make us enthused about consolidation for that reason? Kelly said. Absolutely not. It's irrelevant. In that sense, they're two different questions. Southwest is humming along financially despite the MAX groundings, reporting net income of $659 million with a net margin of 11.7%. The airline's optimistic it can resume MAX flying by February, though it made no assurances. The FAA must clear the aircraft first. Like American Airlines, Southwest said it expects to receive compensation from Boeing, but executives say they don't know how much money the airline will receive or when it will come. I think to sum this all up, we need to call upon a top-notch journalist. What do you think? Well, if you're a veteran listener to this show, you'll recognize the voice of flying senior editor and friend of mine in the show, Rob Mark. Rob's also the founder and editor-in-chief at jetwine.com, too. And on his Aviation Minute podcast on October 16th, Rob shares this.
Years ago, when I was still flying for a living, I remember seeing a cool little yellow sticker slapped on the side of another pilot's jet bag. If it ain't Boeing, we ain't going. The slogan was a nod of professional respect for the Seattle aircraft builder that brought America into the jet age with great airliners like the Boeing 707 or the three-engine 727. And who could forget the world's first double-deck four-engine jumbo, the 747? Boeing built nearly 1,500 of those. Boeings were known for their ability to take a beating and bring everybody home in one piece. Pilots who flew Boeing's B-17s during the big war knew that, as did the B-52 drivers when that airplane started flying 70 years ago. Then there's Boeing's 737 with slightly more than 10,000 airframes built, an impressive number by any measure. Within the variants, of course, there's the now infamous 737 MAX, an airplane Boeing originally created to give the Airbus A320neo a run for its money. While it looked like that might happen a few years ago, the grounding of the MAX last March pushed the idea of a profit on that airplane pretty much out of sight to the folks at Boeing's HQ. The problems for Boeing, of course, began in 2018 when the crew of a Lion Air 737 MAX lost control of the airplane and crashed shortly after takeoff. It was only after 189 people died on that flight that Boeing admitted it had created the airplane using a software update called the MCAS, a system designed to make the pilots believe the MAX handled like earlier 737s, even though design-wise that wasn't really the case. What really shocked pilots after the first accident, though, was the realization that Boeing never mentioned the existence of the MCAS to anyone, not in the POH or not even in training. That's because Boeing was that sure the MCAS's flawed software would never kick in. Those odds dropped precipitously, though, after the crash of a second 737 MAX in March of 2019. The entire MAX fleet was grounded shortly thereafter, with the U.S. being one of the last to take action. Each week, the news about what Boeing is doing, or what it should be doing, or what Boeing engineers and management knew and when, seems to reveal something new. And let's not forget that the FAA played a significant role in this mess, too, for its lackadaisical oversight of the MAX certification. Boeing first thought the MAX would be back flying soon, but as more and more uncomfortable and unbelievable facts have emerged about the design and the execution of the MAX, the date for the next flight just seems to have drifted further and further into the future. The company's been hit by hundreds of millions of dollars worth of lawsuits from the families of accident victims, and the Southwest Airline Pilots Association just sued Boeing for back wages due them for the 30,000 flights that have been canceled now that the airline's 34 737 MAXs have been sitting on the ground for 7 months. SWAPA's lawsuit claims Boeing, quote, abandoned sound design and engineering practices, withheld safety-critical information from regulators, and deliberately misled its customers, pilots, and the public about the true scope of design changes to the 737 MAX. Ouch. Then there's the Boeing whistleblower case from a company engineer who told Boeing the MCAS would never work. The stories go on, and they just don't seem to get any better. Trying to get the MAX flying again has become a huge distraction for normal business at Boeing. The company's already lost orders on the MAX as well as for some 787s. The company's progress on the 777X project has also slowed considerably. And because the FAA played a role in the MAX dilemma for its poor oversight of the airplane's certification, EASA in Europe and a number of other regulators want Boeing to perform tests especially for them before they'll recertify the airplane because, quite honestly, they've lost confidence in the FAA's assessment of the problem. Now, if I was still teaching at Northwestern, the Boeing MAX story would easily become a quarter-long case study into what happens when people within an organization refuse to talk or listen to each other. That case study would also look at what happens when the people who sell things take over from the people who design and build things in a bureaucracy, like when insiders saw this coming at Boeing long before the MAX ever flew. But that's how bureaucracies operate. Looking ahead, no one's even asking whether airline passengers will ever believe the MAX is again safe to fly, no matter what Boeing and the FAA say. I remember when plenty of people refused to climb aboard a DC-10 decades ago when that airplane was released from its grounding following a number of fatal accidents. Just think for a minute. In less than a year, Boeing, one of America's largest single exporters, trashed a reputation that took more than 100 years to create. Now, I have no doubt the 737 MAX will rise from the ashes next year because Boeing and its lobbyists have way too much power to keep it on the ground forever, technical issues or not. Of course, Boeing's Dennis Muhlenberg lost his chairman's seat last week in this mess, but the damage has already been done. One of the next stories to watch for is going to be precisely how Boeing and the FAA roll out their plan to convince pilots, flight attendants, and maintenance technicians the MAX is now safe to fly again. A plan that, of course, won't include any simulator time for pilots to get a close-up look at the MCAS before their next flight. But I think the really big story is going to be how Boeing and the FAA convince paying passengers and regulators around the world that there's nothing to worry about when they climb aboard a MAX. Maybe Boeing's going to change the airplane's name. But if it looks like a duck and walks like a duck, well, you've heard that one. Or maybe it's going to be a slick TV commercial. Maybe something that sounds like, "We're Boeing. And every time you climb aboard a 737 MAX, you can absolutely, positively trust our product because we're pretty darn sure we got it right this time." Of course, I'm thinking about those stickers I'm going to see one of these days that pilots will slap on their carry-ons. If it ain't Boeing, we ain't going. Probably. For jetwine.com, I'm Rob Mark in Chicago. We'll see you next time.
Well, if you like that, make sure you subscribe to Jetwine and the Aviation Minute at jetwine.com. There's a link in the show notes. And if you like what you're hearing here, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss a thing. And I'd really appreciate it if you'd tell a friend. In this small and amazing world of aviation, we all know how important a personal recommendation can be. So don't go away just yet. The show isn't over because Sully hasn't spoken yet. And yes, he will. First, though, this show is brought to you by the generous support of patrons on patreon.com who make per-episode contributions via PayPal or credit card. People like new patron Michael Rogers and Tom Qualwasser, with whom I had the pleasure of sharing some espressos while plane spotting last week. They find value in the show, and I thank them and all of our other patrons for their support. And if the subscription-based model isn't right for you, well, there's a link to buymeacoffee.com/BravoGolf. There you can pledge just $3 one time, and I'll send you a personalized thank you. There's links in the show notes. On the very last page of the Indonesian Lion Air report, a paragraph jumped out at me. It's by none other than the great Captain Sullenberger. And unsurprisingly, it might be the most simple, thorough, honest, and direct way to sum up this whole thing. Indonesia's conclusion is shared by former U.S. Airways Captain Sully Sullenberger, who's flown a 737 MAX full-motion simulator that was programmed to replicate both fatal 737 MAX accidents. In a recently disclosed letter, Captain Sullenberger stated, "Pilots must be capable of absolute mastery of the aircraft and the situation at all times, a concept pilots call airmanship. Inadequate pilot training and insufficient pilot experience are problems worldwide, but they do not excuse the fatally flawed design of the MCAS system that was a death trap. As one of the few pilots who have lived to tell about being in the left seat of an airliner when things went horribly wrong with seconds to react, I know a thing or two about overcoming an unimagined crisis. I'm also one of the few who have flown a Boeing 737 MAX Level D full-motion sim, replicating both accident flights multiple times. I know firsthand the challenges the pilots on the doomed accident flights faced and how wrong it is to blame them for not being able to compensate for such a pernicious and deadly design. These emergencies did not present as a classic runaway stabilizer problem, but initially as ambiguous, unreliable airspeed and altitude situations masking MCAS. The MCAS design should never have been approved, not by Boeing and not by the FAA."
I'm Nick Herring from San Diego, California. The Podcasting on a Plane podcast is presented for entertainment purposes only. Brandon's comments and those of his guests, the website's content, and any social media, etc., are not a part of his official responsibility as a controller or as an FAA employee. The views and opinions you hear on the podcast are his and those of his guests, and not necessarily that of the FAA. There is no nexus between Podcasting on a Plane and the FAA. Also, while he is a CFI, he's not acting as your CFI, nor is he your mechanic, your doctor, your shrink, or your spouse. This podcast is presented for entertainment, camaraderie, and fun, but is in no way, shape, or form professional advice or legal counsel. If you are in need of professional advice, get some from somewhere more appropriate than a podcast, no matter how good this one may be.